Welcome to another episode of the CPG Guys podcast. Our co-hosts, Sri Rajagopalan and Peter V.S. Bond, explore how brands and retailers engage with consumers online, in-store, and everywhere in between. And now, here are Sri and Peter. Well, this episode is a very special one for Sri and me because we feature two women who are trailblazers and part of a group of friends self-described as the Band of Sisters. Now, we're not talking about a Tom Hanks movie. The Band of Sisters is about 6 women who came together from senior leadership in corporate America and, like us, are on a mission to promote gender equality. They are women Sri and I have worked with during the early stages of when Sri worked at PepsiCo and I was on site at PepsiCo working for IRI. We used to walk by many of their offices and be in awe, wondering if one day we could have one-on-one conversations with these thought leaders. Well, Sri, that day is here, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we've got 2 such leaders and change agents and change makers with us today. They've also recently released the best-selling You Should Smile More, How to Dismantle Gender Bias in the Workplace book. We will discuss female empowerment, leadership, and gender equality and the importance of supporting this cause. Please join us in welcoming to the show, first, Cie Nicholson, investor and advisor at a number of startup companies, a speaker and a founding member of the Band of Sisters. After spending 11 years at PepsiCo in marketing positions, including the chief marketing officer role for Pepsi-Cola North America, after PepsiCo, she served as EVP and CMO of Equinox, Senior Vice President and CMO of Softcard, a fintech startup by Google. And if you follow Cie on Instagram like I do avidly, you can experience her ongoing tribute to her alma mater, the University of Illinois, with pictures of her performing incredible handstands that Sri and I ourselves could never do in numerous notable locations around the world. She presently serves as a public board director for Selective Insurance and also served as private board member for Heartland Food Group and the Association of National Advertisers. Sri, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you, Peter. Joining us today is also Lori Tauber Marcus, a corporate board director, executive coach, and founding member of the Band of Sisters that Peter just alluded to. After spending 24 years at PepsiCo in multiple roles, including Senior Vice President, Marketing Activation. After PepsiCo, she served as SVP CMO of the Children's Place retail stores, which is, I'm sure, I have bought from at some point in life. EVP, Chief Global Brand and Product Officer at Keurig Green Mountain Coffee, which I'm sure is in many of your homes, and interim Global CMO Peloton Interactive, which I'm also sure is in many of your homes.
They need to be in our homes, Sri.
You bet. Lori is now a board director of public and private companies. And Peter, I'm going to hijack the moment because I've been waiting for it.
Go ahead.
And I'm going to fanboy these two, but it's not just these two. It's all the Band of Sisters, starting with Lori, starting with Cie. Back in the days in the early 2000s, I don't want to date any of us. When I was starting out my career, I would walk past your offices in 6'2" and 4'3" and whatever it was, the 3 2s and the 3 1s. And I'm referring to Purchase on Somers, New York, the headquarters of Pepsi. And I'd always wonder when I could get 5 minutes with you folks. And then all our lives moved on. And here we are, it was destiny would come back together. For me, this is a fanboy moment. Y'all are trailblazers. We're on a mission here on female empowerment and gender equality. They could not have been a better moment, better month for y'all to come on the CPG Guys. And I am just excited to get going. Peter?
Yeah, let me start by saying I was actually on 3-3 in a room in the middle with no ambient light. As a vendor, I was just looking for vendor equality. Not just, but let's move beyond that and let's talk about the Cie Lori. So good to have you here. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Thank you.
Oh my God. So before we get started, would love for you guys to just elaborate on what is the mission of the Band of Sisters. Tell us about how this all came together, because I know I worked with many of you. I worked particularly closely with Angelique when she was in customer marketing, and I just love to know how you guys all decided to do this.
Yeah. So I'll start. The thing that I think is probably the most interesting is that we did not set out to write a book together. We were having a fun dinner a few years ago, back in 2019, with Indra Nooyi, who at the time had just retired as the CEO and chair of the board of PepsiCo. And it was a small dinner, maybe 6 or 7 of us. And somehow over the course of the dinner, I got to talking about how I had been a founding member of the Women's Resource Network at Pepsi back in 1993. And we had started that Women's Resource Network. I was a middle manager at the time. And we started that network because even though we had a lot of women in headquarter marketing functions, there weren't women at the tippy top of the organization. And there certainly weren't women out in the field, you know, in customer facing roles, in distribution and operations facing roles. So we knew we needed to do something. And, you know, as one does when you're in middle management, you don't worry about whether you have sponsorship at the top. You just kind of jump in and you try and make things happen. So fast forward to, you know, nearly 30 years later. And what we were talking about was over the course of our careers, we had each experienced these little moments that made us feel like we didn't fully belong. And again, we all made it to, you know, amazing places in our career, but there was this constant theme of just these little things, just little experiences that we had. And I'll let Cie give you a couple of examples of what those might be.
Yeah. So like these, I mean, we have like 31 of them in our book, but what would be an example micro moment? It's the women often being told the one to, you know, will you take the notes, you know, in the kind of the office housework. If it's not taking notes, it's like, hey, can you set up the next Zoom call? Or, hey, we're having some AV problem. Can somebody go find the AV support, you know, and generally will be a woman. The title of the book being told like, hey, you should smile more. Yeah. That's something that all women have probably been heard with the work situation on the subway, in the street, whatever. I mean, guys are not told to smile more. Women are told to smile more a lot. So they get the irony in that. That we have a chapter called Great Idea, Greg. That's somebody, you know, Lori will say something in the meeting and people will kind of talk around it. Next thing you know, Greg will restate it. And all of a sudden then we go off on Greg's idea. And it's just like, you know, so it's you know, so those are just all these kind of small moments that almost seem like they're too small to bring up at any given time. They seem petty, but they just kind of continue to add up. So as Lori said, like we all had great careers. We made it through the gauntlet. We made it to the C-suite. We're now in the boardroom. But we look back and we think, oh my God, this stuff is still happening. And the reason we know it's still happening is because of the fact that we went out and did primary research with hundreds of younger women to figure out if these things were still happening. And indeed, they are. So anything that's in the book is still happening. So the crux of the matter is that the walls of gender inequity are not built with huge stones. It's brick by brick by brick by brick. And they just over time kind of build up a wall. And so there's been tons of research on this to talk about this happening, but not advice of what do you do about it. So what we wanted to do was set out and give voice to these awareness to these issues, bring up conversation, and have a practical guide of how you could potentially address some of these things.
All right. Thank you for framing that out. And we're going to carry that through the conversation. To our audience, I want you to know that we've embedded in the digital liner notes of this podcast links to both Lori and Cie's LinkedIn profile and link to where you can purchase the book that they've just authored, You Should Smile More. So please avail yourself of those links and go get the book. It took me all of 36 hours to read this book end to end, and it's highly marked up in my Kindle. I love it, and I can't wait to go forward with this conversation. So let me start us off. You know, you've structured the book into sections that identify what you call spheres where gender inequity often runs amok for professional women. And then you provide recommendations on how 3 different archetypes might respond to these situations. Can you first walk us through what are the sections to frame that out, and what are the archetypes that you're trying to help inform as to how they can deal with these situations?
Yeah, I'll jump in there, Peter. It's Lori. So what's interesting is when we sat down to write this, I worried, of course, as a worrier, that we wouldn't have enough content. And so we started kind of just writing in our massive Google document, what were some of these situations? I mean, Cie referenced a couple, the sort of the Great Idea, Greg, or You Should Smile More, or Susan, will you take the notes, or other things like that. What we found was actually like we quickly got to 25, 30, 35, 40 different scenarios. Cie also mentioned that we went out and did research. One of the things that we just weren't sure of. Were these just things that we experienced as our time growing up in middle management as senior managers in our operating careers. And now, of course, we all do other things as board directors, or, I also do executive coaching. Cie mentioned she's an investor, advisor to early stage companies. So we knew that we, women in our, I'll say 50s, were experiencing this, but we didn't know if these scenarios were still being experienced by younger women. And what was, I guess, fascinating, but not in like a wonderful kind of way. What was fascinating to me is, chapter by chapter, calling a woman a girl, father of the year when you're giving men trophies for, things that women are just expected to do day in and day out. All of these different things, getting very intimate with women about asking them questions about their pregnancy, all of these different chapters, and there's 31 in the book. What we found was that younger women were still experiencing these things. They might look a little different. So they might have had stories that were about trivia night. I'm not sure that we had trivia night back in the 90s. They had a lot more example of how they experienced work through a digital and or a hybrid model. But these micro moments, these little incidental or accidental acts of sexism, this unconscious bias, they were still experiencing it. And so just to finish up with your question, the book really spans across multiple things. It's things that people say about us to us when we're in the room. It's things that are said when we're not in the room. Some of it we do cover. Everyone wants to make sure we cover all the things that women do to self-sabotage. So we do cover a little bit of that, like the constant apologizing that many people like me are prone to do. We have a special section that's all about things that happen in hiring and promotions. We have a section that's about sort of, workforce games, all of the, the trivia night, the golf, and, women not being included in some of those things. And then one of the areas is all about sort of some of the, awkward chivalry that sometimes happens at work. So we cover kind of a broad spectrum across these 31 chapters.
And then on the three audiences that we are talking about, there's the women that are experiencing the micro moments, and how might you go about handling it, or whatever your strategies. And given there are 6 of us, we don't always all agree. We have quite a bit of diversity even within our band of sisters. So it's for the women that are experiencing them. It's for bosses and leaders. And this could be either gender, because the fact that they want to have a really productive team, so it has to be very inclusive. So for bosses, and then allies, and this can again be men or women. And this is the largest group. You are sitting in the room when some of the stuff happens, and you might, what do you do, or what can you do? And we've talked to men, a lot of men in particular, and they want to do the right thing. I just feel like in some cases they don't necessarily. What other steps can they do to make them an ally? I mean, the example I gave before over Lori says something, and then Greg, steps on top of it and starts talking, and the conversation goes that way. I could be like, hey, let's get back to Lori's point. I thought Lori made a good point. How do you bring it back so it's obvious that Lori was the one that started off that conversation? Let her get credit for it. Let her take it versus just, Greg take it that way. So there's all these different tips and techniques to be able to, be an ally for the people. So those are the 3 groups. But one of the big premise for this book in our speaking engagements are women cannot solve this on their own. This isn't yet another thing for women to do. It's impossible to do it. What we can do is these things are so small and often not talked about, which is why they're still happening 30, 40, 50 years later. And women often roll their eyes. And a lot of times guys are like, is that a thing? I didn't know that was a thing. I mean, it's not a thing because no one ever brings it up. So we're trying to give language to it, encourage conversation, give suggestions of how to get around it so we can make the culture more inclusive and better for everyone.
Yeah, I'll just share a quick story here. I happened to be last night speaking at a pen club of Westchester County. I spoke at one of their events at the Chappaqua Library last night. And what's funny is I mentioned the title of the book, and then you just sort of have this, people were kind of looking at you. And then when I held up the book and people could tell, oh, it's like a thing that women are told. And you get this look on women's faces like, oh my God, if I had $1 for every time I was told to smile more, I would never need to work again. And what's interesting is you get this immediate recognition of with women, whether they're 25, 45, 65, or 75. And with men, as Cie said, I had so much fun when we were doing the research because literally, as I was trying to bring along former male colleagues, male bosses, and I would tell them about some of these things, like a dumb example, the cellophane standoff, which is one of the chapters about how, women are always ending up doing housework at work, unwrapping the bagel platters and things like that. And, men will sit there till 2:00 in the afternoon before they think to unwrap the bagel platter for the breakfast catering. And you'd say it to women and they go, oh, the cellophane standoff. And then you'd say it to men and they'd go, oh, I didn't know that happened. And then you do another chapter and they go like, oh, I didn't know that happened. And while my first thought was to get annoyed at it, I just realized it's sort of, not to sound like a marketer with like awareness, trial, repeat, depth of repeat, but part of it is you have to create awareness, right? If you're going to have men as allies and men as bosses, and you're really trying to draw them in, you have to start by assuming positive intent and assume that they don't wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to ask Lori to take the notes today so I can hold women back in their progress. And so assume that there just isn't that awareness. And as you get to some of the practical sections in the book about, for women, for allies of any gender, and for bosses of any gender, I think a really important thing is that we assume positive intent and we start by creating awareness, and then we get very practical about what you can say and do in the moment. But importantly, sometimes it's hard in the moment to react. And so we also give suggestions about what you can do after the meeting and sometimes preemptively in a meeting before a future meeting.
I guarantee you one thing, Cie and Lori, after listening to this episode, the next thing I'm going to be doing when we are at a breakfast meeting is watching who opens the bagel tray. Guaranteed. And I'm probably going to point out who should be opening the bagel tray as well.
Exactly.
He's going to first thing he's going to do is make sure that there is cellophane so that he can conduct his little experiment. So
I love that.
Guaranteed.
It's actually, we've talked to, obviously a bunch of men, and in some of the cases, they're like, oh my gosh, I now hear people use the word girl, I'm not going to use again, or, the cellophane stand. One thing that's great about these micro moments, how do you fix them? Micro solutions. These are simple things to fix. It's not like a 10-year infrastructure project that you're not going to see any progress. You can literally make changes in your next meeting. So it's very simple to solve many of these.
I think that the beauty of the book is the simplicity of the solves. Mm-hmm. But I also don't want to give excuses that, hey, I didn't know, so that's why I did it.
Right.
Go read the book. And it'll tell you what you can improve. It's not that hard. It takes maybe an hour and a half, or get it on a Kindle. Do it while you jog, while listening to the book. It's not that hard. Which kind of, staying on the theme of the book, the thought that comes to my mind while reading the book is there's a lot of research supporting the theories and the arguments and everything we've discussed already in the book. So how did you actually get your hands? Did you interview a ton of people about sourcing all of this rich academic material? And then how did you divide up? The Band of Sisters is truly a band of sisters. It's more than two of you. How did you divide up the responsibilities between each of the contributing authors?
Well, I'll start fleshing out the research a little more, then Lori, you can talk about the process, because the fact that I think that I will then be called on to carpet for the process. But on the research, we did went out and looked at a lot of academic research. And then we supplement it with our own primary research of literally hundreds of interviews of people that we talked to. And I think that one of the really interesting things in the research that we find out talking to these younger women, besides, again, nothing in the book that hasn't been validated to the point where they're like, oh my God, are you looking over my shoulder, is that some of the women today are actually feel less equipped to deal with some of these issues, which we thought were surprising given that we're here 30 years later. But the reason is our generation, Lori and I, we had low expectations going into the workforce because of the fact that our business school class was 80% men. The president of the class was a guy. They were getting internships. We were just kind of, fitting in. And so when you get there in your first week of your new job and they're like, oh, we're taking out the distributor. We're going to go to Hooters for lunch. You're like, oh my God, you kidding me? But you just did it. Today, that stuff is not as overt. It's a little bit more insidious. But women today have gone through, they had Title IX. It was girl power. They have their act together. Women are graduating high school at a greater rate. They're going to college at a greater rate. They're getting better SAT. They think they've got this. Some of these guys are actually dopes, right? And then they get into the work world and all the stuff changes and they're like, hey, Lori, will you take the notes? And hey, have you met the new girl in accounting and blah, blah, blah. And so since they came in with higher expectations, it's almost harder for them to figure out, like, they're just like gobsmacked, whereas we kind of saw it coming. So I thought that was, to me, one of the most interesting things about the research.
Yeah. And then, Sri, to answer your question about sort of how did this, it reminds me of when we were kids, like, how does a bill become a law from Saturday morning TV? Does anyone remember that?
Schoolhouse Rocks.
Thank you. I can never remember where it's from, but I always said, like, how does a bill become a law? And then my daughters kind of look at me like, I don't know why that's an interesting phrase that you just inserted into the conversation. But I feel like this is kind of the question on everyone's mind, which is like, how do 6 executives who are used to being in charge and, candidly, as, C-suite executives, maybe ordering other people around to get work done, how do they actually get work done? And how does the real question is, how do 300 pages of like source material on Google Docs become a book that people would want to read? And so it's actually, this is the part where Cie was mentioning where, maybe she's either the hero or the villain of the story. I'm not quite sure. But we started talking about this stuff. We put together all these scenarios. We went out and we did a talk. I think it was at Ad Week, maybe 3 years ago. And we weren't sure if there was a there. We knew it was interesting, but we weren't sure if anyone else was going to find it particularly fascinating. And as we went out and we did a couple of these presentations, we realized they wouldn't let us get off the stage. I mean, people had so many questions. It was such a topic that people were dying to talk about. And parenthetically, I just want to say, part of the reason that I think people were dying to talk about this is it's the whole notion of micro moments. They're not big things that you run into HR, you run into your boss. They're little tiny things. So each person, you don't want to bring it up. You sound like an idiot if you bring it up. I don't feel seen because at the at the offsite, they're only offering, men's golf shirts as the swag. Like, you sound like a jerk if you bring up any of these things. But little by little, women just they face them and they're like bricks on your shoulder. They just exhaust women over time. And worse yet, when you're referring to who's the new girl in accounting, language can be very minimizing. So the point is, part of the reason I think there was so much hunger for the topic was because no one ever talked about it. They talk about the, God forbid, the Harvey Weinstein, the Jeffrey Epstein, Me Too moments, but nobody talks about these little things. So I think as we went out and started talking about it, people were just so happy because they thought it was only themselves that were experiencing it. And they were so validated and they felt so heard and seen that we were not only talking about it, but talking about what you can do. So with that as background, we thought, okay, we'll spend the next 2 years and we'll go out, and we had speaking lined up at some major corporations. And we're going to do a big launch event at PepsiCo in March of 2020. And then what happened, the pandemic hit. So I think some of us were thinking, oh, good, I'll catch up on Netflix. And then Cie was like, no, you're not going to relax. Like, we're going to turn this into a book. You can't take through 2 months of the pandemic off. And so really, I give Cie a lot of credit for, in her own lovely, Midwestern way of just kind of keeping us focused and just saying week in and week out, we're going to really flesh out these scenarios. And for each of the scenarios, we're going to give advice for the women, turning the, bystanders into upstanders or allies, and then really what the bosses can do as well. And so we did all the research, we did all the writing, and that's really what we did during the pandemic when other people were complaining about being at home. We were looking at it as an opportunity to write the book.
Lori, I'm going to ad-lib something just listening to you
Feel
speak.
free.
Because I see this a lot in the field. I do hear from a lot of women when I'm in the field every week because of the day job I have. But I do hear women tell me about the golf. You correctly pointed out the golf stuff. So I hear a lot of these little things you pointed out.
Yeah.
What is your high-level advice for women? Because I hear you say, sort of be careful about bringing these things up, but I hear them all the time. And then it also coaches me to be better as a male ally every time I hear it. Now I know that golf is actually quite polarizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think what I would say, I'm going to answer your question specifically, but in general, if I were to go back and read the book again, we didn't set out to do what I'm going to describe, but I do feel like in general, there's kind of archetypes, right? So as Cie mentioned, we don't agree on most things, which I think is great. I think that's part of the power of the book. There isn't an answer or one answer. You can sort of choose your own adventure. Oh, I like the way Lori handled that, or I really like the way Mitzi handled that. And in general, what I would say is, you know, there's ways to handle things in the moment, like using like a direct approach. Cie often uses humor, which allows her to get away with a real direct approach. I sometimes use a gentle pivot. You know, I'll kind of pivot the conversation to something that's more inclusive. Angelique is really good at the use of the pre-meeting and sort of the meeting after the meeting. So there's different ways of going around it. But I want to be clear. I don't think that the answer is to do what we did and just roll our eyes for 30 years and be exhausted by it. I think there's opportunities for women to bring these things up when they're experiencing it, again, in the meeting, after the meeting, before the next meeting. And I think there's a real opportunity for men, whether they're bystanders looking to become allies or whether they're the boss, to in the moment speak up. And I'll give you an example. At this book event that I was at last night, young guy, he was talking and he said he was at something and he had his 5-year-old with him and his wife had some event and somebody said, "Oh, that's so great. You're babysitting your son." I don't remember son or daughter. And to his credit, he looked at them and he said, "You can't babysit your own kid. It's just called watching your kid." Right? When a woman is taking care of her kids, we don't say she's babysitting for them. So that's a great example where something like that, where you do the thing in your mind of what I'm saying to a woman, would I say same thing to a man or vice versa? And he, rather than it always being women that have to point it out, he pointed it out and he chose not to use humor. He's a lawyer. He just kind of hit it straight on. And then everyone in that room, you hope, walked away saying, "Oh yeah, I shouldn't say babysit." Like he's not father of the year because he's watching his own kids. So I think, Cherie, the real thing is don't do what we did. Don't just live with them for 30 years. And then just be exhausted by it. You don't have to hit everyone like a 10 out of 10, but don't let them go because they do accumulate and they do exhaust women. And especially in this job market where, you know, people are dying to get, you know, great candidates and great talent, you can't afford to have women be exhausted and just checking out.
Thank you for that, Lori. So you mentioned you've got 31 different areas you focus on this book. We don't have enough to cover all of them in this podcast, but there are a couple that we've curated that Cherie and I are particularly interested in. So we'll offer it up to you and let you describe some examples and even some great responses for the various archetypes that Cie was detailing in the opening. So let's start with language. You know, how is gender-biased wording, particularly what we call casual language, an unacknowledged way a company maintains institutional inequity and inequality in the workforce?
So I'll start with actually our first chapter is called "Who's the New Girl?" And this one happens to be a real hot, but I'm probably the most passionate about this chapter. But I think I've recruited some allies. I think that and I'm using the word girl, but it's broader than girls. There's more gender language, but just using the word girl as an example. You hear it all the time. Have you met the new girl in accounting? Hey, we just hired a new girl out of Harvard. You just would never say the other thing. No one says we just hired a new boy out of Yale. And I think you could say, well, is it that big of a deal? And sometimes women are often say this as well, so they can add to it. But I think if we think of our male colleagues are thinking of their female colleagues as girls, we're kidding ourselves to think they're going to think like, hey, who's the next CEO slate? You know, and if we kind of have this diminishing language along those lines. And so one thing that I would do is when people would say that is like if someone said, have you met the new girl in accounting? Sometimes it's so positive, like, oh my God, she's great. I mean, they're thrilled with her, you know, but they'll say, have you met the new girl in accounting? I'll be like, okay, say the same thing again, but pretend it was, you know, you were talking about Bob and not, you know, Susan. And then they try to say it and they start laughing because they can't say, have you met the new boy in accounting? It just doesn't, it sounds crazy. So that's a good way to kind of, that I found is an interesting technique to use. But again, it's beyond the word girl. You hear a lot of words that have a male reference that are very positive. Gentleman's agreement, man up, manpower, ballsy, you know, the first you're a startup, you're two guys in a garage. A lot of the female-oriented words are diva, Debbie Downer, like run like a girl. Or one of our favorites is the whole thing when you're doing innovation and you put the test of like, is it easy enough that your mom could do it? As though like that's the lowest common denominator. So these, like words matter. And then Laura, you can expound on lazy language.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, just to give an example, like I said, Cie can get away with, like, she's so friendly and inviting. And so directly hitting it with humor works really well for Cie in the moment. Underneath this Connecticut lady is a snarky young woman from New Jersey. So I'm a little bit more careful when I go direct at things because I feel like sometimes I can get really snarky really quickly. And so in that situation, what I would often do is when they say, oh, have you met, the new girl in accounting? I would say, oh, have I met Jill Brown in accounting? Yes, I met Jill. She's a world-renowned fill in the blank. She has incredible experience in fill in the blank. She came to us from fill in the blank company. I was in a meeting with her last week, and I'm already seeing the contribution that she's making in fill in the blank area. So what I've done is at that point, rather than just sort of, hit it head on, I'm using it as to like double, triple amplify that woman. And so that's another way. Like I said, you have to sort of figure out what works for you in the moment based on a little bit of who you are. And then also the psychological safety that you feel in that moment to address something head on, or maybe take a little bit more of an indirect approach.
Laura, talk about lazy language. That's one of your favorites.
Oh, yeah. Lazy language is definitely one of my favorites. So there's this whole chapter or group of things in the book that I think they're all under the topic of lazy language. So we say things like, she's too emotional, or we're interviewing candidates and you're going through the debrief and we say things like, she's just not a great fit. Or in, people planning stuff, they'll say, I just don't know that she has the gravitas of what we expect at an SVP level, like in Peter's eyes. And on the flip side, and we'll talk about these in a second, but on the flip side, you have this sort of like, if those are kind of lazy but demeaning language for women, we have the opposite of that, which is, say it with me, he's a great guy. And so you're doing people planning and someone will be talking about John and they'll go, oh, John's a great guy. And you're like, where on the sales competency model is great guy? Or, the worst one, like, oh yeah, we know him from Choate, or, we know him from Sigma Chi. All of these things that just kind of, we're not talking about skills. We're not talking about accomplishments. We're just talking about general feeling. And like I said, where it can often give, I'll say sort of like cisgender white men a little bit of a tailwind, the opposite can be true for women. And what has happened historically is you say them and everyone like writes down like, yeah, lack of gravitas. And so I think on this one, it's pretty universal that for anyone, whether you're a friendly Midwestern woman or you're a snarky woman from New Jersey, I think it always works to go back to situation, behavior, impact, and always ask people to say gravitas. Not sure what you mean by that. Can you go back to like, what was the situation? What was the behavior? What was the impact? Or can we go back to the sales competency model or the finance competency model? I think without being snarky, without being funny on all of these things, we've got to get the organization focused on specifics, not on this kind of general lazy language.
Y'all both have already coached me on a ton of mistakes that on thought I've made in my own life. And I probably use many of these statements in those people planning sessions that you just referred to myself. So we got to fix that for sure.
Yeah.
So in the spirit of fixing, right, the name of the book is You Should Smile More. We've smiled a lot on this podcast, kind of acknowledging a bunch of things that I think I've done in my own life and perhaps Peter has. But it's what's pretty clear is the name of the book is sarcastic. You should smile more. So tell us more. Why does the term used in the name of your book, You Should Smile More, really not coming from the most constructive place, and why is it sarcastic?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the examples, like I said before, of one of those things that women are told. And I believe the people who say it, I genuinely believe this, that it comes from a good place. I think people are trying to be helpful. And we all know that there's this pretty narrowly acceptable band of behavior for women in the workplace, right? And so if you're, outside of that, you might be shrill, and so women just, again, it's where men are, doing cartwheels on, mats, if you use a gymnastics analogy, and women are like trying to do their job on a balance beam, right? Not too much of this. It's a little bit of the, what's the nursery rhyme? Like, just sort of not too big, not too small, just right. You have to be sort of like such a narrow band of behavior. And so You Should Smile More is one of those examples that, like I said, when you're talking to 25-year-old women or 55 or 65-year-old women, they get it instantly. And one of the insights on this was, sort of the white male insight of, oh, I didn't know that women get told to smile more. Like they just didn't know. They've probably said it from a place of, oh, you'll be seen as more positive or more inviting or whatever. I really believe people have been telling women this for decades out of a good place, but it's not helpful. It's not specific. And all it's doing is making that balance beam more and more narrow. And then one insight that, again, we're all on a learning journey. My hope is every day you just learn something new. Someone points something out, and then hopefully you just put that in your toolkit and you're like, oh, now I just don't call women girls at work. I used to say when we first started doing the book tour, I would say things like allies, men or women. And somebody pointed out to me that's not very inclusive. There are people that don't identify as men or women. And so I just now say of any gender. And so it's just like a little thing, but I think if we each get better every day, everyone will be better. But the insight that I would just add on this chapter was when we were doing the interviews and we interviewed a bunch of women of color and they said, oh, I didn't know white women got told to smile more. They thought it was just Black women that got told to smile more because of kind of the stereotype of the angry Black woman. So that was like a learning for me as well. And again, I think it's a good nod to, all genders out there who don't realize that some of the things that you're saying when you think you're being helpful, they're just narrowing the balance beam.
I thought that this was about this chapter. You had Katie Lacey, who actually said she had it written in a performance review to do it, to smile more. And Lori said, gosh, I was told to smile less because I would be, taken more seriously. So
wait. See, I want to hear that again. Somebody wrote in her performance review, she's got to smile more.
For Katie. Yeah.
Holy smokes, that.
Yeah, she had many positive things in the performance review, but one of them was a suggestion. So on that side was smile more. And then Lori has been told, smile less, you'll be taken more seriously, and maybe you're too approachable or too accessible. But it just speaks to that narrow balance beam.
Yes. And just to thank you, Cie, for reminding me of that. The thing that is so crazy about that is, so imagine here I am, it wasn't like I was told that when I was 25, right? So I had gotten to like a pretty high level in the company. I had a lot of success, not because of some genius IQ, but because I was an incredible leader that, created great culture. People wanted to follow me. And then I was told, put a little separation between you and your organization. Stop being so accessible. And I just remember having this moment of like, what do I do with that? Like, I literally just don't even know. And that's when women kind of throw their hands up and, they feel a little bit like a rag doll. Smile more, smile less. It's just like, you just want to go home.
But if you talk to women, not every single person, but many people have been told one version of that. It's a very common refrain. And like, no guy has ever been told that. I mean, like, it just doesn't happen. So it's just interesting. That's one that's pretty, bifurcated.
I want to remind our audience that all of our content is available on cpgguys.com. Please go there, leave us a rating and review while you're there. And if you think you have something that you can contribute to our community conversation, please drop us a line at contact@cpgguys.com. Well, this has been such a great conversation that Cherie and I have already decided we're having you back for part 2 because there's a lot we wanted to cover. we just got so immersed in this conversation. So Lori and Cie, we are so grateful for you joining us. We're going to have you back for part 2 on a fast follow because there's so much more to cover. But thank you so much. You lived up to our expectations. We're so honored that you joined us for this conversation today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
We loved it. That was awesome.
Thank you to you both. All right, we'll talk to you very soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
The content in this podcast episode is provided for general informational purposes only. By listening to our episode, you understand that no information contained in this episode should be construed as advice from CPG Guys LLC or the individual author, hosts, or guests, nor is it intended to be a substitute for research on any subject matter. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by CPG Guys LLC. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. The views expressed by CPG Guys LLC do not represent the views of their employers or the entity they represent. CPG Guys LLC expressly disclaims any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, or inability to use this podcast or the information we present in this podcast.